This is the powerful, research-based, true-to-life story of Onoli, a young man from Anambra State whose search for identity led him into the dangerous world of confraternities. Once a loyal member of the Vikings, Onoli's life took a dark turn when he gained admission into Enugu State University of Science and Technology and defected to the Black Axe. Rising to become the #1 man of the Brotherhood, he broke the most unforgivable rule, leaving one cult for another. Years later, his past caught up with him in his hometown, where the Vikings carried out a cold, calculated execution. In the heart of Anambra State, a region known for its industrious people and deep traditional values, the story of Onoli began. His community was like many others in southeastern Nigeria, a blend of strong family structures, cultural pride, and a growing youth culture that wrestled between moral discipline and modern rebellion. Anambra, through the late 1990s and early 2000s, was witnessing a shift in how young men viewed power, influence, and protection. It was an era when secret brotherhoods, once hidden within universities, began to spread into local communities. For many young boys growing up in those towns, these groups became symbols of courage, masculinity, and identity. In those years, the Vikings confraternity had already built a reputation in Anambra. To the ordinary eye, they were just street boys who moved in coded unity, but to those within their orbit, they represented a structured network of loyalty and power. They held their own laws, oaths, and codes of silence. Onoli was a quiet boy, observant, calculating, and always aware of the environment around him. He came from a family that valued education, yet like many families in rural and semi-urban communities, he was exposed to the complexities of street life. His teenage years were filled with both ambition and curiosity about the hidden forces that shaped the lives of young men around him. The Vikings' presence in his area was unmistakable. They organized local gatherings, influenced neighborhood disputes, and often acted as informal enforcers in the community. Their language, gestures, and appearance fascinated boys who longed for belonging. To them, the Vikings embodied strength. Onoli's first encounters with confraternity members came through acquaintances, men slightly older than him who carried themselves with confidence and authority. He admired their sense of brotherhood. Over time, the admiration deepened into interest. By the time he was in his late teens, the social influence of confraternities had grown to the point where every young man either aligned with one or risked being viewed as weak. Pressure often came in subtle forms: conversations, friendships, and small favors that eventually demanded loyalty in return. For Onoli, joining the Vikings was not a decision of rebellion, it was a decision of identity. He saw in them what his society glorified: protection, recognition, and prestige. Though he was aware of the risks, he believed the Brotherhood could give him the sense of belonging and purpose that many youths in his generation sought. His initiation into the Vikings was a turning point. From that moment, his life was governed by a code that went beyond friendship. It demanded silence, secrecy, and absolute loyalty. The experience changed his outlook completely. He began to see himself not just as an individual, but as part of something larger, something that transcended fear. Within the group, he found both unity and discipline. They moved like soldiers, operated with signals, and upheld their laws as sacred. In his early days, he participated mostly in meetings, gatherings, and minor assignments. He quickly learned that the Vikings were not just about power, they were about structure and order. However, beneath that order lay a system built on revenge and pride. Every betrayal was avenged, and every act of disloyalty punished. That rule would one day determine Onoli's fate. His family remained proud of him, unaware of the hidden allegiance he carried. They believed he was simply another young man preparing for university, focused on his future. Behind that facade, Onoli was living two lives, one in daylight, guided by family values, and another in the shadows, governed by the laws of the Vikings. The structure of confraternities outside campus was different from the ones within. In towns like his, the lines between fraternity loyalty and criminal enterprise often blurred. Some members engaged in protection services, Others enforced street order or involved themselves in local political schemes. To survive in such a world required strategy, and Onoli was observant enough to learn fast. What set him apart from others was his calmness under pressure. Even in confrontational situations, he was known to think before reacting. This trait earned him respect among peers and older members alike. They saw in him someone who could grow into leadership. But fate had another design for him, one that would drag him into the deepest contradictions of confraternity existence. His decision to pursue higher education would expose him to a world where loyalties were tested, boundaries crossed, and choices could no longer be undone. By the end of his teenage years, the boy from Anambra had already made a name among the local Vikings. He was no longer seen as a recruit but as a trusted brother. Yet, in his heart, he still nurtured dreams beyond the brotherhood, dreams of education, recognition, and transformation. In that pursuit, he would soon leave his hometown for Enugu State, carrying with him both ambition and a secret that would one day cost him his life. By the time Onoli turned 20, he had already become familiar with the undercurrents of confraternity culture in Anambra. His community was divided between those who feared the Vikings and those who admired their boldness. To some, they were a menace. To others, they represented protection from rival groups. For young men like Onoli, growing up in such an environment meant learning early that survival depended on who you associated with. His introduction into the Vikings was not spontaneous. It came after months of observation and subtle interaction. He was not the type to rush into decisions, but peer influence and the hunger for respect played strong roles. The group's activities fascinated him, the coded gestures, the unity, the sense of belonging. In the midst of a system where the government failed to provide opportunities and communities struggled with poverty, confraternities offered identity and power. The Vikings in Anambra were organized in cells known locally as decks. Each deck operated under a chain of command that reported to higher regional structures. The members moved discreetly, but their influence was everywhere, in bars, on the streets, and even within social gatherings. Their presence commanded both respect and fear. For initiates like Onoli, the process of acceptance was rigorous. The Vikings valued commitment above all. Those who joined were expected to understand that their new allegiance was permanent. His admission into the Enugu State University of Science and Technology came like a fresh wind of hope. To his family, it was a dream realized, proof that their son's future was secure. To his Viking brothers, it was a source of pride. One of their own had gained entry into a university known for its strong confraternity presence. Before leaving Anambra, Onoli received the blessings of his deck's leaders. They reminded him that his allegiance to the Vikings remained eternal, regardless of where he went. They made it clear that once a Viking, always a Viking. That farewell would later become a prophecy of doom. As he packed for Enugu, he carried with him two things: his ambition to become a graduate and his loyalty to a system that demanded eternal allegiance. But universities like Enugu State University of Science and Technology were complex grounds. They were arenas where power was redefined, and survival required not just courage but strategy. The moment he arrived on campus, he realized that his old rules no longer guaranteed protection. The confraternity hierarchy there was different. The Black Axe controlled major influence. They were not just a group, they were an institution within the institution, commanding respect from students, fear from rivals, and attention from authorities. Onoli's presence as a Viking in that space would soon challenge every law of loyalty he had ever known. He had entered a new world where ambition could either make a man or destroy him completely. When Onoli arrived at the Enugu State University of Science and Technology, he stepped into a world that existed on two levels. On the surface, it was an academic environment filled with young people striving to build their futures. Beneath that surface, however, was an invisible network of confraternity influence that dictated social order, fear, and authority. Enugu was unlike his hometown. It was a city of diversity, full of students from different regions, each bringing with them fragments of their backgrounds. The campus, buzzing with life, was a miniature version of Nigeria itself, energetic, competitive, and sometimes chaotic. For many students, the first year of university life was about finding stability and self-expression. But for those who came with a past like Onoli's, it was about learning how to survive in a system already mapped by power blocks. He came into the university carrying his identity as a member of the Vikings confraternity. In Anambra, that had given him status and protection, but in Enugu State University, it meant something else entirely. The Black Axe confraternity held dominant influence on campus, with established structures that extended far beyond the university gates. They had the numbers, the connections, and the legacy. To most students, they were untouchable. For Onoli, this was an uncomfortable reality. The Viking presence in Enugu State University existed, but it was not that strong, overshadowed by the strength of the Black Axe. He quickly realized that old affiliations did not automatically guarantee safety in a new environment. The rivalries between confraternities on campuses were deep-rooted, and his identity as a Viking automatically placed him on the opposing side of the dominant group. At first, he decided to maintain a low profile. He focused on his academics, avoided unnecessary attention, and tried to stay out of confraternity politics. His strategy was simple: blend in and survive. But university life has a way of drawing men back into the very systems they try to escape. Within months, he started noticing how the Black Axe operated. They were organized, confident, and strategic. Their members were not only feared but respected for their influence within and outside the university. They had links with alumni who supported their operations, and their leadership structure resembled that of a disciplined paramilitary order. To an observer like Onoli, this was fascinating. He had come from a background that glorified loyalty and strength, but what he saw in the Black Axe was efficiency. They were not simply driven by emotion or revenge. They functioned with precision. Their unity was based on purpose, and their reach extended beyond the campus gates into the corporate and political spaces of Enugu City. The Vikings in Enugu State University, on the other hand, operated with caution. They were smaller in number, constantly pressured by rival groups, and less organized. They relied on secrecy more than influence. The imbalance of power between them and the Black Axe was evident. For the first time since joining the Vikings, Onoli began to feel vulnerable. His confidence from home met the reality of a different terrain. It became clear that loyalty to the Vikings could limit his survival chances. In a place where the Black Axe commanded dominance, association with their rivals was dangerous. Still, he tried to keep his allegiance quiet. He attended lectures, stayed off confrontations, and built friendships outside confraternity circles. During his second semester, as he grew more familiar with campus life, his perception of confraternity dynamics evolved. He saw that the Black Axe fraternity offered opportunities, leadership, connections, and social dominance. They operated almost like a shadow government, and joining them meant access to power that few could achieve through academics alone. His curiosity began to conflict with his loyalty. The more he observed, the more he admired their organization. He understood the risks. Crossing from one confraternity to another was not just forbidden, it was considered the ultimate act of betrayal. Among confraternity historians and campus observers, transitions like that were extremely rare. They symbolized defiance, and the penalty was always fatal. Yet, for Onoli, the desire to belong to something stronger began to outweigh the fear of consequences. As semesters passed, he became more withdrawn from the Vikings community in Enugu State University. He stopped attending meetings and distanced himself from known members. It was the beginning of a quiet disconnection, one that would soon escalate into an irreversible decision. What began as admiration for the structure of another group slowly turned into alignment with it. And as time would prove, the line between observation and participation is thinner than many realize. By the end of his second year, whispers had begun, whispers that Onoli, once a Viking, was drawing close to the Black Axe. To those who knew confraternity culture, that was not a rumor to ignore. It was a signal of war, and its outcome would change everything. By the time Onoli reached his second year at Enugu State University of Science and Technology, the boundaries that had once defined his loyalty had started to blur. What began as mere observation of the Black Axe fraternity's discipline and reach had evolved into something deeper, a silent admiration for their power, unity, and strategic dominance. In the complex ecosystem of Nigerian universities during the 2000s and 2010s, confraternities operated like invisible empires. Their structures resembled underground governments, each guided by strict codes of conduct, ranks, and territorial control. The Vikings and the Black Axe were among the most recognized, but their ideologies and internal systems differed in significant ways. The Vikings, to which Onoli originally belonged, prided themselves on fearlessness and valor. They were the warriors of campus cultism, daring, aggressive, and confrontational. But the Black Axe, known historically as the Neo-Black movement of Africa, represented something broader: influence beyond violence. Their members positioned themselves in corridors of power, extending their network into politics, business, and community leadership. That difference fascinated Onoli. He began to notice how Black Axe members carried themselves differently, not just as students, but as men on a mission. They appeared focused, strategic, and highly coordinated. Their influence stretched across hostels, faculties, and even local nightclubs around Enugu. To a mind like Onoli's, this power dynamic was intoxicating. He had always been a man drawn to structure. Back in his early days as a Viking, he admired courage and dominance. But now, as he matured, he admired intelligence and strategy more. What he saw in the Black Axe was not just strength but systemic power. Power that lasted beyond campus, power that could transform a man's social standing long after graduation. That realization marked the beginning of a dangerous attraction. He started associating with students known to have connections with the Black Axe. It wasn't direct at first. He'd sit in gatherings where they were present, share academic discussions, and gradually blend into their social circles. He learned more about how they operated, their hierarchy, signals, and internal discipline. Unlike the Vikings, who often thrived on open showdowns, the Black Axe valued silence, precision, and coded communication. It was this quiet strength that drew him closer. But attraction to the Black Axe came with consequences. Once whispers began that a Viking member was showing interest in the Black Axe, the news spread fast. Within the Viking circles at Enugu State University, Onoli's distance did not go unnoticed. He no longer attended gatherings, did not respond to coded calls, and avoided meetings. Those who once called him brother began to question his silence. In confraternity systems, silence is rarely innocent. It often signals doubt or defection. For Onoli, the pull was internal. He found himself analyzing the limitations of his original brotherhood. The Vikings, though fierce, lacked the structure that the Black Axe possessed. Their unity was often tested by internal disputes and scattered leadership. The Black Axe, on the other hand, appeared like a machine, organized and unstoppable. His mind became a battlefield of conflicting oaths. He had sworn allegiance to one brotherhood, but now found inspiration in another. In Nigerian campus cult culture, this conflict of loyalty is not just psychological, it's spiritual, ideological, and existential. Members are conditioned to see their confraternity as family. As semesters passed, Onoli had drifted so far from the Vikings that there was no going back. He had crossed from mere fascination to informal association. This period marked a transformation not just of allegiance but of mindset. His definition of brotherhood changed. He began to see confraternity not as a symbol of raw dominance but as a system of order and continuity. His integration into the Black Axe would not be immediate or public. Those processes took time and discretion. But psychologically, he had already crossed the line. Observers of Nigerian confraternity history often note that transitions like this are born out of philosophical realignment rather than fear. Men like Onoli didn't switch sides to seek protection. They did it because they saw a more powerful vision of what brotherhood could be. For Onoli, that vision was rooted in the Black Axe's ideology of structure, influence, and collective advancement. It represented everything he wanted to become: respected, disciplined, and connected. By the end of that academic session, he had quietly detached himself from the Viking code. No formal announcement was made, no confrontation occurred, but within the system, everyone knew that Onoli was no longer among them. He had chosen a path that would redefine his entire identity. And from that point forward, there was no turning back. The man who once feared being vulnerable under the shadow of the Black Axe was now finding his strength within their structure. He had crossed the invisible line, and his new journey had just begun. By the time Onoli entered his final year at Enugu State University of Science and Technology, he had already undergone one of the most psychologically complex transitions any confraternity member could experience. He had abandoned the ideology of the Vikings, the very group that shaped his early years, and quietly embraced the Black Axe, a fraternity whose presence reached beyond the university gates. In the underworld of Nigerian confraternities, no decision carries greater weight than defection. It is not simply a matter of personal choice. It is a declaration of war against one's former identity. Members who cross over are considered traitors, men who have defied sacred oaths sealed with symbolic rituals, brotherhood codes, and sometimes blood. For Onoli, the decision was not impulsive. It evolved through long observation, silent study, and deep reflection. He understood the dangers. He understood that the Vikings were not an organization that tolerated betrayal. Yet his convictions were firm. He had outgrown the chaos and wanted to belong to something he saw as more purposeful, structured, and visionary. 4 months, Onoli lived in a state of quiet transformation. He learned how to navigate both worlds, appearing neutral in public while privately absorbing the ethos of his new affiliation. The process was not ceremonial in the traditional sense. It was intellectual and emotional, an inner induction into a brotherhood whose power lay in coordination rather than chaos. Within a short time, Onoli began to rise. His composure, intelligence, and experience made him a natural leader. By the final months of his academic year, Onoli's reputation had grown beyond campus. Other confraternity members, even those from rival groups, recognized his presence. As graduation approached, the internal leadership of the Black Axe fraternity began to reorganize. Vacant ranks were filled based on loyalty, contribution, and vision. When the time came to appoint a new number one man, the highest authority within their structure, Onoli's name stood at the top of the list. His appointment was not contested. His journey from an outsider to a central figure had been witnessed by all. He had proven himself through loyalty, resilience, and results. The fraternity trusted him, and his leadership symbolized a bridge between past and present. Becoming the number one man carried enormous responsibility. The position demanded authority, wisdom, and absolute control. The leader was the custodian of the Brotherhood's principles on campus, responsible for coordination, decision-making, and maintaining discipline. It was both an honor and a burden. Under his leadership, the group's activities became more coordinated. Internal disputes were reduced, and violent confrontations became less frequent. He pushed for a version of brotherhood that valued intelligence over brute force. For a time, this approach worked. The fraternity's reputation strengthened, and its members gained respect both on and off campus. However, this success came with a hidden cost. In the confraternity world, leadership and visibility attract both admiration and danger. The Vikings, his former brotherhood, had not forgotten his defection. To them, Onoli's rise within the Black Axe was more than a betrayal. It was an open insult. A man who had once sworn allegiance to their cause now stood as a leader in an enemy camp. Defection might be forgivable in politics, but in the world of confraternities, it is an eternal mark of treachery. The Vikings watched from a distance, and while years passed, their memory did not fade. Onoli's success only deepened their resentment. Every achievement he made as a Black Axe leader was seen as a challenge to their pride. For Onoli, these tensions remained mostly invisible. He had learned not to look back. His focus was on graduation, completing his studies, and continuing to live by the ideals he now believed in. Yet, in confraternity systems, the past is never silent. It waits. As his final exams approached, he had no idea that his return home after graduation would reopen the scars he thought had healed. For now, he was at the height of his influence, unaware that his greatest achievement, leading the Black Axe, had already written the first lines of his downfall. When Onoli assumed the position of #1 man within the Black Axe confraternity at the Enugu State University of Science and Technology, his name began to circulate far beyond the campus. Inside Enugu State University, his leadership marked a new phase, structured, intelligent, and guided by discipline. Outside the university, his rise signaled something deeper, the return of balance within a system that had long been chaotic. For many years, confraternity structures within Nigerian universities had been dominated by cycles of violence and revenge. Leadership positions often changed hands through intimidation rather than merit. But in Onoli's era, things appeared to stabilize. The Black Axe fraternity, known for its deep historical roots and widespread presence, operated under strict hierarchical systems. Every leader had to maintain unity among men with diverse temperaments, from the calm intellectuals to the impulsive enforcers. Onoli approached leadership with the patience of a strategist. He understood that true power was not about how loudly one could command, but how effectively one could organize. Confraternity groups in Nigeria often functioned like political parties. Every move by one organization was analyzed, interpreted, and sometimes misrepresented by another. The Vikings fraternity, in particular, viewed Onoli's reformation efforts as a form of provocation. In their interpretation, his efforts to strengthen the Black Axe image were a deliberate challenge, a symbolic statement that his new fraternity had triumphed over his old one. To make matters worse, some of Onoli's former associates from his early Viking days were still active, both on campus and outside. They remembered his initiation, his loyalty, and his earlier vows. For them, his new identity was not just offensive, it was sacrilegious. From a sociological perspective, confraternity systems are built on what researchers often describe as ritualized loyalty. It is not just a code of belonging but a binding psychological and cultural commitment. When a member defects, it disrupts this code, creating a ripple effect that threatens the emotional stability of the group. For the Vikings, punishing defectors was not only vengeance, it was preservation. Yet Onoli continued his leadership undeterred. He focused on expansion and influence. Under his guidance, Black Axe members at Enugu State University began to infiltrate positions of authority in student governance, academic associations, and local networks. They became gatekeepers of campus decisions. The fraternity's presence was felt but never overtly displayed. Their strength lay in discretion. At the same time, Onoli maintained a balance between his academic and confraternity life. He graduated with discipline and composure, a rare combination in a space where many lost focus to the allure of underground power. His ability to maintain academic credibility while managing a clandestine brotherhood earned him deep respect from peers. However, his visibility also made him a target. In confraternity politics, the higher a man rises, the more his past becomes ammunition for his enemies. As Onoli prepared to leave the university, rumors began to circulate among the Vikings in Anambra State, whispers that the once loyal brother who turned his back on them had not only joined their rival but had led them. These whispers grew into resentment. Confraternity historians often describe this phenomenon as the revenge of ideology, when the principles that once bound a man to a group transform into the very weapon used against him. In Onoli's case, his success was seen as defiance. The Vikings, whose creed emphasized vengeance against defectors, took his leadership as a personal insult to their name. By the time he completed his final year, his fate was already sealed, though he did not yet know it. Still, those final months at Enugu State University represented the peak of his life. For the first time, he had achieved a balance between intellect and influence. His leadership was respected even by rivals who disagreed with his choices. He had transformed from a street-level confraternity member into an organized, visionary leader who could command loyalty through respect rather than fear. When he finally graduated, the celebration was quiet but meaningful. For him, it marked not just the end of academic life but the completion of a journey that had shaped his identity. He looked forward to returning home, away from the constant tension of campus life, unaware that the storm was waiting there. After graduation, Onoli packed his belongings and left Enugu for his hometown in Anambra State. The decision seemed ordinary, almost natural. Every student eventually returns home after school. But for a man like him, whose name had become symbolic in confraternity circles, returning home meant walking into a landscape filled with both admiration and resentment. In Anambra, confraternity influence was not limited to campuses. Many former members had integrated into local politics, business, and security networks. The Viking structure there was particularly active, and information traveled fast. Within weeks of his arrival, word spread that the defector had returned. Those who knew the confraternity code understood what that meant. Onoli, however, did not return as a defiant man. He came home quietly, hoping to rebuild a life outside confraternity walls. But in the complex web of brotherhood ideology, one cannot simply walk away from history. The bond of initiation, even if renounced, remains in memory, not just of the individual, but of the collective. Back in his village, he reconnected with family and old friends. He stayed cautious, avoided nightlife, and rarely spoke about his university life. To outsiders, he appeared like any other graduate, calm, polite, and focused. But to those who remembered the oath of the Vikings, his peace was seen as arrogance. They believed he had mocked their creed by living freely after breaking their code. Researchers studying confraternity conflicts across Nigerian states often point to this moment, the post-graduation period, as the most dangerous phase for defectors. On campus, systems of control exist, and violence can be contained. Off-campus, however, the boundaries disappear. Retaliation becomes personal. By the time Onoli's name resurfaced among Viking circles in Anambra, the interpretation was simple. The code had been broken, and the price had to be paid. The man who once led with intelligence and restraint was now being discussed in whispers, not as a leader, but as a target. Still, Onoli lived unaware of the gathering tension. To him, his confraternity years were behind him. To his former brothers, they were not. The line he crossed in Enugu had followed him home. And in Anambra, that line was about to be redrawn in blood. The return of Onoli to his hometown in Anambra State marked the beginning of the final and most dangerous chapter of his life. For him, it was a simple transition, from university life back to his community, from leadership responsibilities to a quiet, civilian existence. But for the Vikings, the confraternity he once belonged to, his presence meant something else entirely: unfinished business. In the confraternity ecosystem of Nigeria, especially in the southeast, allegiances do not dissolve easily. Once a person is initiated, he carries the invisible mark of that organization. Leaving one's fraternity is not viewed as a mere resignation. It is treated as a permanent act of defiance. The Vikings, whose code of conduct is built around unwavering loyalty, classify defection as an abomination, a sin that cannot be forgiven, regardless of the time that has passed. As a result, confraternity networks maintain intricate intelligence systems, even outside university environments. Ex-members, sympathizers, and local allies often provide information about the movements of key figures. Through these informal channels, the news of Onoli's return reached the Vikings' command structure in Anambra. To them, it was not gossip, it was a call to restore honor. They saw his defection to the Black Axe years earlier as a humiliation. It wasn't only that he had left, he had joined their fiercest rival and even risen to become the #1 man. To a confraternity built on prestige and pride, that was an insult too deep to overlook. In their internal ideology, it violated both tradition and identity. Onoli's years at Enugu State University were known beyond campus. His leadership, his reforms, and his influence had been discussed across confraternity networks. While he had managed to avoid direct conflict during his time in Enugu, his quiet success had made him a legend among some and a traitor among others. Now, back in Anambra, that legend was being rewritten. From a sociological viewpoint, this type of retaliation is what researchers describe as symbolic justice. It isn't always about the individual, it's about the message. For the Vikings, allowing a defector like Onoli to live freely would encourage future betrayals. His punishment, therefore, would serve as an example, a reminder that no one can renounce the brotherhood and prosper. In Anambra, the Vikings' hierarchy began to deliberate. Within their code, the process of executing revenge was not random. It involved coordination, approval, and verification. Each action had to be justified, recorded, and symbolically meaningful. Onoli's case was treated with such precision. His file was reopened, not as an immediate mission but as an official restoration of order. He was now a marked man. Researchers studying confraternity operations in Nigeria often note that the concept of marking is one of the most feared phases in confraternity conflict. Once an individual is marked, every movement is monitored. It doesn't happen overnight. It can take months or even years. The purpose is psychological as much as physical, to ensure that the target's fate becomes a slow inevitability rather than a sudden event. For Onoli, that inevitability began to take shape gradually. The Black Axe fraternity, though powerful and widespread, had limited reach in his local community compared to the Vikings. In that region, the Vikings had deeper roots, stronger connections, and loyal networks that stretched from street level to influential figures. For Onoli, this imbalance of territory meant isolation. The network that once protected him in Enugu was far away. Here, he was alone. By the time he realized how deep the tension ran, it was too late to escape it. The Vikings' leadership had already sanctioned his punishment, an execution not just of a man, but of what he represented. His story had become a symbol of betrayal. Within confraternity studies, such actions are often described as acts of ideological purification. The execution of a defector serves as a ritual cleansing, restoring the group's spiritual and moral balance. For outsiders, it appears as violence. For insiders, it is viewed as justice. As weeks turned to months, the tension in the air thickened. In local bars and street corners, stories about his defection resurfaced. Some exaggerated, some fabricated, but all shared one theme: the time for reckoning was near. The same networks that once celebrated him for his intelligence and calm leadership now whispered about his impending downfall. Every former confraternity member knows that silence can be more dangerous than open threats. And in those last months, silence was all that surrounded Onoli, heavy, unbroken, and final. The Vikings had made their decision. The evening of the execution was deceptively peaceful. The sun had dipped low over the Anambra skyline, painting the clouds in soft orange hues that reflected off the rusted zinc rooftops. The smell of burning firewood drifted through the town as women prepared supper, and the faint chatter of children echoed in the distance. Nothing in the air hinted at the tragedy that was about to unfold. Onoli moved through the neighborhood that evening with quiet confidence. He wore a plain t-shirt and jeans, blending easily into the crowd. To an ordinary observer, he was just another young man enjoying the calm of a rural evening. But those who watched him that day, men hiding in plain sight, saw more than that. They saw the target whose name had been marked on a list years ago. The Vikings' operation was precise. It had been planned for weeks. The order to execute Onoli had come from higher up, from men who saw his betrayal not merely as a personal offense but as an attack on the very foundation of their brotherhood. To them, his defection to the Black Axe was symbolic treachery, a message that had to be silenced. They chose that particular night because they knew he would be relaxed, off guard, and at home. Their sources had confirmed that he often visited a close friend who lived near the town's central junction. It was a spot with few police patrols, minimal lighting, and easy escape routes, a perfect location for what they had to do. Onoli's friend had invited him to discuss plans about a potential job offer in Lagos. He was excited about it. It felt like the beginning of something new. For once, he talked about his future without fear. But fate is cruel to those who try to run from their past. Unknown to him, the men who sought his blood were already moving in silence. The first motorcycle passed by slowly, scouting the area. Two riders, dressed casually, with faces hidden under black caps. They noted his presence and made a brief signal before turning around. A few minutes later, two more motorcycles appeared. Each carried two men, disciplined, quiet, and determined. There was no shouting, no warning, no visible rush. It was an execution, not an attack. As Onoli left his friend's house and walked toward the small road that led home, the air changed. The sound of approaching motorcycles broke through the calm of the night. He paused briefly, perhaps sensing something. It was too late. The first shot came from behind, clean and deliberate. Panic erupted instantly. People nearby screamed and ran for cover. Onoli fell, tried to crawl, but the second and third shots silenced him. The execution lasted less than a minute. By the time the motorcycles disappeared into the darkness, all that remained was confusion, fear, and the echo of demise. His body lay motionless by the roadside, the dust beneath him turning darker by the second. It was the end of a story that had begun years earlier in another town, in another phase of life. The police arrived hours later, after locals had gathered and whispered theories. Everyone had an explanation, but few dared to say the truth aloud. In regions like Anambra, confraternity-related executions were not new. People knew when to talk and when to stay silent. To speak openly about such matters was to invite trouble. His family was notified before dawn. The news hit his parents like a thunderbolt. He had hoped his son's university education would erase the scars of youthful mistakes. But the past that Onoli tried to bury had risen to claim him. His mother's cries filled the compound, echoing into the early morning sky. The local authorities began an investigation, but as often happens with confraternity-related violence, witnesses disappeared, and silence filled the gaps. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. The hitmen had vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. What was left was pain, rumor, and fear. For days, the town was tense. Some whispered that it was the Vikings who did it. Others suggested it might have been a rival faction within the Black Axe itself. But those who understood the deeper codes of the street knew the truth. Onoli's execution was a message. It was meant to remind others that betrayal has consequences. In confraternity ideology, especially within older groups like the Vikings and the Black Axe, loyalty is sacred. Once a man takes an oath, he belongs to that family for life. Crossing over to a rival group is seen as worse than desertion. It's regarded as contamination. To them, Onoli's demise wasn't execution, it was purification. In the days that followed, stories about Onoli spread across Anambra and beyond. On university campuses, his name resurfaced in secret discussions among cult groups. To some, he was a symbol of courage, a man who dared to switch paths and rise to leadership. To others, he was a traitor whose end was a necessary warning. Whatever people believed, his story became a case study in the unforgiving nature of confraternity culture. Local newspapers covered his demise briefly, labeling it as another suspected cult-related clash. The details were minimal, and the story faded quickly from public news. In the months that followed, a few of Onoli's associates from the Black Axe in Enugu visited his family quietly. They didn't come to mourn publicly, they came to pay silent respect. In their code, they understood that Onoli's demise was more than personal. It was political. It reflected the constant conflict between rival brotherhoods and the impossibility of escaping that cycle. For the ordinary people of Anambra, life returned to normal on the surface. But underneath, fear persisted. Every young man who walked home late at night felt the shadow of that story. Parents began warning their sons more fiercely about the dangers of campus confraternities. Students used Onoli's example as a cautionary tale in school. His name became synonymous with the cost of crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. His execution reinforced the invisible laws that govern confraternity life. Once you take the oath, you never truly leave. But perhaps, in a quiet corner of Anambra, someone still remembers him not as the man who betrayed a brotherhood, but as the boy who once dreamed of a better life and paid the ultimate price for trying to find it. For many in Anambra, the incident became more than a local tragedy. It became a mirror reflecting a larger national issue: the persistence of cultism in Nigerian universities and the violent network that extended beyond the campus gates. Onoli's story exposed how deeply these brotherhoods had penetrated not only student life but also the social and political fabric of society. His rise, defection, and eventual execution were not isolated events. They were parts of a much broader pattern that scholars, security agencies, and community leaders had struggled to understand for decades. Researchers studying cult dynamics in southern Nigeria began to document his case as a reference point. For them, Onoli's trajectory from Vikings to Black Axe was significant. It illustrated the psychological and sociological challenges of identity within confraternity structures. His defection was not just an act of rebellion. It represented the tension between personal transformation and institutional loyalty. In the worldview of these groups, a man may change his environment, but his oath binds his spirit forever. Breaking that bond, as Onoli did, invites retribution. Interviews conducted with former confraternity members later revealed that the line between brotherhood and enmity in these circles is incredibly thin. Members are indoctrinated to view rival fraternities as existential threats, not just competitors. This explains why Onoli's change of allegiance was seen as blasphemy, a defilement of sacred codes that demanded atonement through blood. The Vikings viewed his switch to the Black Axe as an unhealable wound, an insult to the integrity of their creed. At the same time, his success within the Black Axe confraternity complicated that resentment. By rising to become the #1 man in Onoli's community, elders began discussing the matter in private gatherings. They lamented how their brightest youths were lured into secret cults in search of power, belonging, and status. Some remembered Onoli as a polite boy before university changed him. His teachers described him as intelligent, focused, and respectful. But once drawn into the web of brotherhood politics, he became a different person, bound by oaths stronger than family ties. The younger generation, however, saw his story differently. On campus, Onoli became a cautionary legend. New students whispered about the boy who switched sides and paid with his life. In their minds, he was both a warning and a myth, proof that no one escapes the rules of the street once initiated. His departure discouraged some from joining rival cults, but, paradoxically, it also intensified loyalty among existing members. They used his example to emphasize obedience and fear. Academic institutions, too, began referencing his story in security workshops. At Enugu State University of Science and Technology, where he had once walked as a student, his name surfaced in anti-cultism seminars. Administrators spoke about him not as a criminal, but as a cautionary case study, a young man who allowed the quest for identity and recognition to overpower reason. They used his journey to illustrate how confraternity culture often begins with friendship and ends in violence. Law enforcement officers involved in cult-related investigations also revisited his file. Though his hitmen were never officially identified, the pattern of the attack, the precision, and the background pointed unmistakably toward a Viking organized execution. For security experts, it reaffirmed a painful truth. Confraternity violence doesn't end with graduation. It follows members into adulthood, binding them to lifelong conflicts that transcend academic environments. Within Black Axe circles, Onoli's name carried a different weight. To them, he was a fallen hero, a man who embraced the brotherhood wholeheartedly and died for his choices. His departure was commemorated quietly among select members, often as a reminder of what loyalty costs. In the closed language of the group, such stories are not merely tragedies. They are tests of resilience, signposts to guide younger recruits about commitment and risk. Educational researchers later linked Onoli's departure to a broader failure of mentorship in Nigerian universities. Years later, when new generations of students enrolled at Enugu State University of Science and Technology, some still heard fragments of his story. His name surfaced occasionally among discussions about past confraternity conflicts. To the uninformed, it was just another tale. But to those who knew the system, it was an enduring reminder that oaths made in darkness rarely fade in daylight. In historical retrospect, Onoli's life represents the full arc of confraternity tragedy, from initiation to ambition, from leadership to punishment. His journey embodies the paradox of power and destruction. He sought strength in brotherhood but became a victim of its rigidity. He chased belonging but found isolation. He looked for control but lost himself in structures larger than life. Even in academic papers written years later, his story is cited as an example of how individual rebellion within secret organizations often ends violently. It underscores the impossibility of neutrality in systems built on sworn loyalty. Once a man crosses over, he ceases to exist as an individual. He becomes an enemy to one side and a suspect to the other. Today, in Anambra, the road where he was taken off has changed. Shops line the street, and new houses have risen. The dust that once carried the memory of his fall has been covered by years of traffic and development. Yet to those who remember, the air still holds a trace of that night. The shots, the screams, the silence that followed. The lesson of Onoli remains relevant. It teaches that violence never truly ends violence. It only perpetuates cycles of fear and revenge. It warns that choices made in youth can echo for decades, shaping not only one life but an entire community. And it exposes how deeply confraternity systems have infiltrated the moral fabric of Nigerian society, turning intelligence, loyalty, and courage into instruments of destruction. In the end, Onoli's life is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of humanity caught between belonging and freedom,